Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Karen, doing a great job in Richard's absence. I will tell him that he doesn't need to attend anymore. We have a great replacement. So welcome aboard, everybody. Nice to see some existing people and a couple of new people on there as well. I have dashed in last minute, probably causing more to the panic here from another meeting this morning, and going to talk to you about interview and selecting. Which is another of the HR topics that I do really like talking about. I like interviewing. I like understanding more about people, and I think with the interviewing, the things that really bring me the satisfaction is matching those skills to the jobs and seeing that come to good, committed employees that we find after that. So I'm going to talk for about 30-ish minutes. We've then got question answers at the end, but as Karen said, please do use the chat box. So if there's anything else that you want to contribute to the presentation, share your experiences, ask me questions, please do so as we go along. But as I said, there'll be separate time for questions at the end as well. Talking about the weather, I just flew back from my holidays yesterday morning, so it's actually freezing from me. But I'll get wrapped up with a warm jumper on, and soon my holiday will be a distant memory, as these things are. So for those of you that know me, my name is Joanne Vose. I'm an HR professional. I run an HR consultancy called Red Elephant HR, and I'm also a director at the Business Springboard, where we provide real-life management and leadership training solutions and soft skills. And something that we are really proud of is that our trainers, including myself, are all practitioners as well as trainers, which does give it brings us very good feedback from people in the real-life training that we present. So that's a bit more about me. And as per usual on my webinars, the copyright is to the Business Springboard, and any advice that I give during the webinars is not designed for individual use, but more generic and general stuff in the webinar. Okay, so moving on, what I'm going to talk about today. We're going to be talking about what we really want to find out in an interview and what the main purpose of interviews. Now, I think interviews have changed historically. They also vary quite a lot from company to company, and I think there's I feel a bit loath to use the expression, but kind of an intelligent interview of how I would deem that, of what we want to find out. And I really get frustrated at programs like The Apprentice, which I do actually love for entertainment value. But the interview section just drives me absolutely crazy, because I think they try their hardest to really grill people, and I think this is an opportunity to find out about this person that we want. So if we make the circumstances really unnatural, then are we actually giving us a lot of good information in there about how this person will act in our environment? I don't know. I have my own feelings on that. By all means, you can share yours with me too. I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal framework in interviewing, and then move on to selection tools, particularly about interviews and being objective in those interviews, and conclude with some of my top tips for conducting a successful interview at the end there. Okay, so I always talk to people about interviewing and say that we're really asking two main questions. Very importantly, can they do the job? Now, I'd like to think that by the time we got to interview stage, we've already ascertained that most people that we're going to see can do the job. And you'll probably pick this up from CVs, from qualifications, from past experiences. So as a basic job, and remember we have levels of what's acceptable in our own minds, but as a basic job, a lot of the time, the people that sat in front of your interview, they'll have ticked that box in the main anyway. Obviously, you won't know how well they'll do the job, and will they do it over and above your expectations, and will they do every aspect of the job. But a lot of the people who sit down in front of your interviews, you will already have basically ticked that box. I think one of the most important things that we're trying to achieve at interview is to find out, will they do it the way that we want it doing? This isn't about discrimination. It's not about personal characteristics, but it is about a lot of things that come into the mix of how we want the job doing. You'll know from your own teams that you have at the moment, there's a mix of competency levels, soft skills, the people mix and the attitude. And when people talk to me about issues that they have with people management, a lot of them can come in this outer shell, if you like, of a person. So, and that's really important in the organisation. Now, we've got to really welcome diversity and welcome new things in there. But in all, people are made up of this whole ball of different things in there. And it's all these things that we want to pick away at to say, will that fit within our organisation? Will that bring us the skills, the diversity, the culture that we're actually looking for? So we want to find out more about that at interview, about the culture. Is it right for them? Are they going to fit into our culture? The soft skills that they've got, what we're looking for. I've been to see a client this morning to talk about their culture, and they're very much a creative company, and they have very, a relaxed dress code. It's quite a quirky building. They have a lot of relaxed elements to it, and then some strict ways in the hard work and application of it. There will be a certain type of people that respond well in that. Again, don't get this mixed with discrimination, or we don't want to form clones of the same person, but people will perform better in the environments that they feel more comfortable or they can respond well to. So, for example, if I put somebody in there in the company that I'd been at this morning, where it's very creative, quirky, relaxed, unstructured, and people have to form their own ways of working. If I took somebody, and I am being quite stereotypical here, but somebody, for example, from a bank or from a local authority in a role where they've been given a lot of direction that's quite structured, would they perform well in there? Will they enjoy it? Will they be able to flourish in their careers? And we have to think about that in recruitment, and that's what I'm trying to ascertain. I'm also thinking about the people mix, and particularly in people mix diversity. So if we just have clones of the same people in there, will we actually be able to deliver what we want to deliver? And another good example I can give you here, I worked with a team of directors. There are actually 6 directors. And the board meetings used to become, I will use the word, quite heated, I would say, where people were, they'd be flourish with ideas again, and people become very passionate about it. But then the company wasn't moving forward at all. And I did some profiling with those directors, and we discovered that they were actually a team of innovators, but there wasn't one implementer in the whole of that director level of the organisation. So we recruited for an operations director, and we particularly looked for those skills. So it was very mixed to what we already had, but we were looking for something specific in there. And we recruited somebody that was very strong on implementation. And that organisation has changed for the better drastically since that happened 2 years ago. So we have to really think about, will they do the job that we want it to be doing? And in particular, an attitude in there. I think if there's one hard thing that or people bring to me with quite worries that they have in the people, is when somebody has an attitude that they find difficult to manage, and that can be with managers a really big challenge. So what sort of attitude are we looking for? Can-do attitude, somebody who will take direction, somebody who has ideas, innovators, implementers, etc. So I would put a lot of the focus around, will they do that job the way that we want it doing? And that's what you're there to find out at interview. So, moving on to the legal framework now, it's quite interesting that we do have to think about the employment law at interview stage, because there are things that we need to think about and take on board. And one of the big areas are discrimination, and that's got to start even before we start advertising the vacancy, and looking at the people that we're recruiting for. There will be some times when you could run a job advert and put some potentially discriminatory content in there. For example, if you were looking for a particular sex of a person or a particularly religious background, if the job required it, there are some exemptions to the discrimination legislation. But in general, we've got to be very careful that we're not discriminating against anybody applying for that role. Also got to think about the interview that we have and the facilities that we need to offer for anybody who may have a disability, any language barriers that we have. Think about the terminology and the description that you have. And it is surprising, it can seem quite common sense, but I have had some clients that will have in their head a particular type of person that they want to recruit, and that can sometimes flow through into adverts. So we've got to be quite careful because we can be caught out there. Excuse me. I had a case at interview with a client who invited a gentleman for interview. He came to the interviewed quite well. They were quite desperate to fill this vacancy, and I did have a bit of a skills gap there. They asked him to prepare a presentation for a second interview and get it to them. He didn't do that within the timescale that they'd asked for, and then they they rang him up and said, look, we're desperate, can you come back for a second interview? He then rang and cancelled, saying he had a dentist appointment, could he reschedule it? So that the manager had said, look, obviously it's not working out for either of us, let's just leave it. And then he came in the next day and felt that he'd been discriminated against for that role on the basis of his ethnic origin. So we have to be very careful in there that these can crop up within it. And it's, discrimination to me is common sense. We want the best person to do the job. That's the best skills, the best competencies, and the best people fit, and the things that I went through on the last slide in there. Why would we discourage anybody from a background or have any characteristics or marital status or anything else that would be in there? It's common sense. We want the best person for the job, and we need to make sure that we aren't leaving ourselves open for any sort of challenges in there, both deliberate and not deliberate. So that's something we have to consider. The other bit of the framework, an employment contract isn't an employment contract in the legal sense of what a contract is. So in a legal sense, a contract has clauses to it. It's signed by people, etc., etc. An employment contract may be made up of many different things, including what's said verbally and what is in your advert. So if you say in your advert that you offer private healthcare, and then when the person starts you don't give it, there could be a question raised whether that advert actually formed part of the contract. So you need to be very careful about what goes into the advert and what's verbally said at the interview stage. Also think about keeping good notes of your interviews. I actually went for an interview myself. It sounds really dodgy. It was in a hotel room, and it sounds terrible, but believe me, it was all above board. But the guy took a picture of me. Yeah, it's getting worse, isn't it? A picture of me in a hotel room. But it was as his memory aid to remember the people that he saw. Whether that could give rise to a challenge, I'm not too sure. Whether I'd go through that again, I'm not too sure again. I'm a bit older and wiser. But think about the questions that you take. We can't just rely on memory in interviews as well. But remember that under the Data Protection Act, people do have a right to see information that you hold about them. So people could ask to see the interview notes that you take. So just please be aware and educate managers in there about what information they should be recording and what information that definitely shouldn't be in there. It should be about facts and observations, not interpretations and judgments. I hope that does make sense to you. And by means on the chat, if anybody has had any experience in there where they've been challenged legally at interview stage or at advert, I'd be very pleased to hear anything in there, so please do share that. Emma, how long should you keep interview notes for? That's a good question, and it's one that, as to my knowledge, there's no legal requirement to keep for a period of time. In fact, I would argue against not keeping notes for people that you aren't going to progress with. Obviously, you need to give feedback in your interview structure, which is very good practice and also best practice. So after you've given that, if there's no further reason to keep employee data, then it should be shredded. And that includes the CVs and any electronic copies as well. So I would just be careful of what you do keep, because it is personal data and they're not consenting for you to keep that, especially people that you don't actually bring on. If obviously you did recruit the person, then you might want to keep their information on their personnel file as well as a memory aid. So just be careful of what's being kept there. Margaret, would you ask someone with a disability what equipment they would need, etc.? Would you want to wait for some job offer? We want to make our decision purely on the person doing the job. So I would actually wait until after the job offer, because if you asked for the information what equipment they needed, then you could potentially leave ourselves open to say, well, they didn't recruit me because of that. But on the flip side of it, we'd have a duty to make reasonable adjustments, and it depends what reasonable is. So if you're a small business on the top floor of a building and there was 3 flights of stairs and you interviewed somebody in a wheelchair, then would it be reasonable to expect you to put some sort of lift in to get that person up to the top floor? And as a small business, it may be that you wouldn't. I'm not going to give legal advice specifically on here without knowing exact facts of it, but I would hazard a guess that wouldn't be a reasonable adjustment for you to make. So that's something that you could ask in there. But there may be questions that you have to ask for interview. So if somebody applied, and were disabled and you want to interview them on the 3rd floor, then you'd obviously need to ask those questions about and perhaps make an adjustment to interview them in a more accessible place. It does come down to reasonable adjustments, so it depends on your organisation. Bending, can we keep notes from a prospective interview? Yes, by all means. If you're going to use them for something, then it's fine to keep them for a reasonable period of time, and it's that word reasonable again, which in law terms can be sometimes how long's a piece of string. But I often, if I gave feedback from an interview to say, we really, I think you had a lot of good qualities. You're not right for this role, but there's something that may come up in the future. You're happy for me to keep your details. If they consent to it, then yes, that's fine. If they said, no, I'd like you to destroy them now, then obviously you would have to and you couldn't keep a hold of them. But if you said it's a prospective interview, I would ask that question, because I would recommend that you're quite upfront about that, to say, perhaps we haven't got something now, but I'd like to keep you on file so that we can get in touch at a later date, and then they've got the choice then if they wish to say no. Likewise, if you get sundry applications into your organisation and speculative CVs, if you acknowledge those in writing via email or in writing, then you could put on there, we'll keep your information on file, but should you not wish this to happen, please get in touch and we'll destroy them, just so you're given choice on there about what information that you're keeping. Okay, so I want to touch on, I am going to talk specifically about interviewing, but I just wanted to run through firstly some other selection tools that we've got. Ash, I'm just going to read through yours. I thought it was good practice to keep interview notes for 6 months under the Data Protection Act of people you didn't offer a job to in case they make a claim against the company. Yeah, it's about protection, Ash, that you keep that there. And again, it's what would be reasonable. And we've got a really juggling act here between keeping notes for discrimination period and then data protection laws that says we shouldn't keep personal information without people's consent. So we've got a bit of a balancing act of what's reasonable. I think that if you've given the feedback, bear in mind that if people had to bring a claim, they'd have to do that within 3 months. So if you don't get a claim, it's not going to be after 3 months, because they wouldn't be able to do that, because it's got to be 3 months from the incident on a discrimination claim. And anyway, you've got the 3 months to bring that in. They've got that legally, or else a claim wouldn't be accepted by the tribunals. So 3 months you have got in there that you may wish to keep them for, to give some, in case you did need them for that. So while I say I don't mean you have to as soon as we go out the door, we've just got to be very conscious about where they're kept and what you're doing with them and what the risk is to the organisation if you were challenged on a discrimination basis, juggled between keeping people's personal information. It's not easy that it's HR business. We have got to take a call on what's best to do. If you didn't have those notes there, then if you did get a challenge of it, of course you would have witness statements from the people who did the interview anyway, and those would be relied on in court, but you would be missing those notes if you had destroyed them up to that point. But I think it would be a justification if you gave the feedback, if everything was non-contentious, if you had very clear reasons for not recruiting the person, then it could be a clear reason to not keep the notes so that we disposed of them under data protection. So I would say, if you wanted to keep them for 3 months, if you haven't got a tribunal application within 3 months, then they can't come through anyway. Okay, looking at some selection tools. So Interview is one of the most widely used tools. But within the interview, there are different types of interview, which I'm going to have a bit of a chat about. How we structure an interview, particularly on competency based, which I'm going to come into a bit more as we go forward. Competency based questions are about asking evidence, and I found these really useful because it did become very popular years ago about interviews that people can be skilled at answering interview questions and do a lot of internet research and become a really professional interviewee. And then when we actually recruit them and they weren't so good on the role. And remember, this is we're trying to find out if this person, how they're going to be in our organisations, how they're going to do the job and how they're going to fit into the organisation. So I'm a big fan of competency-based interviews to ask about evidence. And I find that rather than just asking somebody, so how would you do this? How would you write a report? How would you speak to a customer? To ask some competency-based interviews where you say, tell me about a time when you've dealt with a customer query. And when people get into telling a story and telling how it did happen, more natural response comes out, and you're more inclined to get a more natural response, an example of how they would deal with it, rather than, oh, well, I would do this and I would do that and I would do the other, which they could have read online or learned in college, or et cetera, et cetera. So, well, tell me about a time. And I did some voluntary work with a school with people at school leaver age to do some interview skills training with them. And a very big focus now on life skills when you leave school, which I think is a really good thing. And I interviewed some children, and they could put together some good textbook answers of what they should do. And I interviewed one boy who didn't have the best grades in there. He had a very big personality. And I said, tell me about a time when you've used your initiative. And this was probably about 4 or 5 years ago, but it sticks in my mind so much. Because he thought about it, and then he said, oh, me and my mother Jamie were driving along on our bikes, and Jamie hit a parked car, and he fell on the floor, and he was unconscious. And I went over to him and said, Jamie, how many fingers am I holding up? And he could tell me, so I knew he was all right. And it sticks as a really good story, a far more, this child had no great experience to draw on, but he gave me a really good, from-the-heart example about initiative, and that's what we want to see in an interview, something that's going to come through as a real example, so we can get a real flavour about the skills that people have. Just going back to the chat box, Vicky, a question for now or later. Is it reasonable to ask candidates to cancel a short period of holiday in order to start on a training induction? It's reasonable to ask. The question is it reasonable to withdraw if they can't attend? At that point, the thing that you'd be looking at would be unfair dismissal, and I don't think that would fall into it. They wouldn't have a right to unfair dismissal. Would you be breaching contract if they can't start? I would make it quite upfront at the interview stage. If you have something really structured in there to say we have in a training period from this date to this date, candidates would be expected to attend, and then you're very upfront from the beginning. So it's actually dealing with that before you got to it. Because if they can't attend, it's very structured, especially if you're doing things on a larger scale. More the question, would it be reasonable for you to run that at a cost and expenditure for one candidate? I could probably have a guess that wouldn't. Would it be reasonable for you to wait if you did this on a regular basis till the next one? That's a possibility to overcome it. But I would feel quite comfortable to say if they couldn't attend that, I don't think there's any legal reason why you couldn't withdraw that job offer. However, it comes into the fairness of it and your reputation as an employer. You would come then as a very strict employer. That might be what you're trying to portray. That'd be absolutely fine. But my answer to that would be very upfront at the beginning, even at advent stage, or to not waste your time or waste their time in applying for the role. And Chloe, I lost the connection. You're back now. Hopefully I haven't missed too much, Chloe, but you will be able to access the recording at the end that we'll send to you. So if I've missed any there, you can listen to it. I do apologise, I'm a little bit croaky. I hope everyone's keeping up to date with my voice. It's post-holiday. My voice isn't very happy that I've come home. Either that or I'm having withdrawals from cocktails. It's one of the two. Other selection tools that we do have up our sleeves, things like practical assessments. You might want to If it was a job that there was a practical element that you may ask them to do something in there. Again, it depends on the role that you're recruiting for, and you may want to think about a trial and short-term working as well. Now, if you offer a trial to somebody and it's not offered on a permanent basis, do just remember that you're dipping into a different talent pool, because people might be less inclined to leave a permanent job to come for a temporary one. So you need to bear that in mind. But as part of your selection, you might say, come and spend the morning with us and see how you get on with the team, to see if it's working for them as well for you. We're in a different position now as recruiters. Years ago, we had all the power, I would say. So we recruited and we decided who we wanted to report to us. We live in a much more flexible environment now, where people have a lot more choice, and it's much about the candidate deciding they want to work for us as well as us wanting them to work for us. So I would think, is the opportunity where they might come in and spend an hour or 2 hours after you've done your selection, main selection criteria and tools, use those, where you invite them in for a day or half a day or even an hour to sit with the team and get to know and understand the job and the culture and the environment that you're working within. Competency tests might be something that you can use in personality profiles. I do use these awful lot. The paid or unpaid markup for that trial, I would suggest, again, it depends how long it is. If it's under a day, I think it's part of a selection tool, and it's perfectly justified that it's a trial as a selection tool. It's not unpaid work. If you wanted to offer a period of temporary employment in kind of a try before you buy or temp to perm, then obviously that would have to be paid. There's a couple of people, again, if the lost connection, there is a phone icon. It's at the top on your screen across the bar. If you are dropping, it's probably to do with your internet connection rather than things our end. But if you click on the phone icon, you could dial in as well, which will rely on your telephone system, which may be more reliable if you are having an issue with the connection there. But hopefully that will not continue. So back to the paid trials. I think if it's part of your selection criteria, if you went to an assessment day, you wouldn't be expected to pay for that. If it's part of not sitting down doing the job, I think if it was come in the factory and work on the line for half a day, then you're probably into paid territory. If it's come in and sit with our team and shadow somebody doing the job, then that's fine as part of your selection criteria to be unpaid. Kathy, what's the difference between practical assessment and competency tests? Competency tests will more specifically look at things like numerical ability, verbal reasoning, etc., or specific competency. That would be something generic in there, and you can find a lot of those online. I use an array of competency tests that we may use, with more things that are generic, like, as I say, verbal reasoning, a situational judgment, numeracy tests, etc. Again, it depends on the role whether I'd use them. A practical assessment may be, for example, if you're recruiting a mechanic and you want them to come in and change a tyre, using that as an example. Or if you work in a factory and you want to assess them using a particular bit of machinery or equipment that they would have the skills to use, not something that's very specific to you that nobody would be able to use, that would be more like a trial. But if they came in, for example, it was a machinist and said, I can, sew this hem, or if it was a typist and they said I could type 60 words per minute, those would be more practical assessments, where the competency would be actually more about their actually ability in some generic areas. If that makes sense to you, that's fine. Personality profiles. There's a lot of them around. I use one at the moment that's based on the Big 5 personality traits, a very long-standing area. I use these in recruitment. I also use them in appraisals and development too. They're online tests that I use, like the competency tests that I do use too. If anybody wants any further information off me offline about that, by all means get in touch at the end. There's one company that I use the profiles with for every single recruit. What I would say, these shouldn't be a be-all and end-all, because they're situational. They're about the snapshot of that particular time. If you use a very good profile, it will have some good validity in their controls in it, so that you are getting a good result, and they should be able to see if people try to manipulate the answers that they give. But this can give you a very good fit when you're looking at the more people side of the organisation. I had one client that recruited in a call centre. And when we were recruiting, they were saying, well, who makes good call centre people that you're looking for? And they would say, well, it's not so much about the experience, it's about the person fit. And actually with some of their star people, one of them, the star people in his previous work environment, was a chef. So an interview was very specific to cut down and select on that. So we start to profile a couple of their really good employees and look at the specific traits that we were looking for that would make a good profile. And then we recruited to those profiles, and that made a very good recruitment solution for that organisation. The other company that used them on a regular basis they're quite a family-orientated business, and they want people that share that working ethic. So they use those alongside an interview, and they can give us a lot of information to help that. There's a lot of very cheap solutions out there which will give us, remember, we can invest in a lot of time and effort and cost in recruiting somebody. So the more that we can effort we can put in that beginning, get good people on board, the best results we're going to get. And then there's, of course, assessment days that pull a lot of these things together and can give a nice opportunity to look at a group of people together. So while we think there can be a big cost, there can actually be less cost because we can bring a number of people in today and have some assessors there and come to a decision at the end of that day. We just need to be careful about what tools we use in assessment. The police force, I'm not sure, I haven't looked through the attendance list. We have had people from the police force on the webinars before. And I won't say I've been critical of the police force, but I think just a word of caution that they seem to have moved out to, but years ago they used assessment days and kind of threw every single recruitment tool into this assessment day. And it can be a bit disjointed. We need to look at what we want to get out of it, so very structured against what will bring us good results at the end. It also, depending on how you do the assessments day, will allow the candidate to get a good flavour of what you're about and what the company's about and how you will be when they get there, so they can make an informed choice as well. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so this is something, again, I won't say it's one topic because it's any topic that I can talk a lot on. So we'll press on to some specific selection tools. So as I've said in the previous one, what you're looking to achieve, what do you want to find out? So if you want to find out if a person is a good sewing machinist, would you want to know that they worked in an office for 10 years and really go into a lot of depth about competency-based interviews on that basis? Would you want to test them on a computer if they were never going to use one? So really think about what skills do you want to find out about and what do you want to look. Very importantly, how are you going to score performance? I think this is where you do have to have some flexibility and train the assessors that you've got in there. I had a personal experience. I did work in a mental health unit in the NHS for some years, and they had a very structured, in a particular trust I worked in, selection process that was very much based on scores for answers gave at interview. And unfortunately, because they'd told everybody, and out of fairness, that they'd published this very strict scoring criteria, it could leave you with a candidate that you had no doubt at the end you had to recruit because they scored the highest, but your gut feel and the more softer side that you got there wouldn't come across that person would actually give you the best value in the person joining the organisation, or that they would be the happiest in that organisation. So think very carefully about what sort of scores you're going to give, and ensure if you have a number of assessors in there that you are, you do have some comparison to make it fair as well. Would you prefer to weight tasks heavier? So if you have a number of tasks, how much are you going to give? If they perform great at interview, but their competency tests are shocking, will you still recruit them? Or will you, look into that further? Would it just be room for further discussion? What are you going to get out of the tasks that you use? I think we've got to put this effort in, because if we do it at the beginning, we need to think what information we're going to bring from it. And then think about what resources you have, both in terms of the assessors available, the space you have, and how much money you want to spend on the recruitment procedure. In the resource as well, I work for a company who'd recently been bought by a large Swedish company, and they're moving into nice new shiny offices that had just been built. But at the time, the offices that they had were weren't very nice at all, actually. They're quite awful. And I was recruiting for the growth of the company to move into this new building. And I arranged a load of interviews, and I was finding that people weren't turning up for the interviews. When I got in touch with them, you were meant to come for an interview, you didn't turn up. Oh yeah, we came the night before to have a look, and I just decided it wasn't for me. And I was under the impression that it was a building that looked so run down, it wasn't in the best place, and it didn't really reflect the organisation as it was. So I started to arrange the interviews for a hotel down the road, and people started turning up. And in the hotel, I'd say, okay, we're moving into a new building. This is the address of the new building. This is what it's going to look like. I'd talk about the company culture and what we're looking to achieve, obviously. And then I'd have a second interview and say, look, the second interviews are going to be at our existing offices. So I was very open and upfront and transparent about it. And that made a massive difference to my recruitment procedure. It's because people will be getting them forming the wrong impression. So we need to be very careful about the resources we have there. We don't want to oversell ourselves, but we don't want to undersell as well to organisations, which brings us to being objective on there and thinking about what we actually want. Now, the type of the interview that we're going to have there, we want that to be suitable for the role and think that we're looking to appropriate and valuable information. And this is why I don't like those apprentice interviews where they absolutely grill them. Now, don't get me wrong, I have recruited somebody and give them a bit of a hard time, but it's been appropriate to the job. So I was recruiting some internal salespeople, and I did give them quite a grilling because they're going to get a grilling in the role. I wanted to see how resilient they were going to be, how they'd come back with my objections. But obviously I wouldn't do the same interview if I was recruiting for a receptionist, for example, or a factory worker or a doctor. You have to think about the job that you're recruiting for. So you need to set this fair structure and be consistent with all your candidates that you have on there. Okay, so the informal interview is the most commonly used. You look at the roles and experience. You generally talk through a past based on the CV or the application form. And this is where we have to be careful because the interviewee can learn that skill. So think about how you're going to overcome that. I came out of an interview once, and I think I was in there for about an hour and a half, and I thought, I must have only talked for about 10 minutes. And my husband said to me, how'd it go? And I thought, I really don't know. I'm presuming not well. And I got offered that job, and it was actually an HR director who'd interviewed me. But I think the big thing here is the 80-20 rule of not talking too much. And I always say my structure for an informal interview would be to set the scene at the beginning, let them, obviously introduce yourselves, thank them for coming, tell them what the structure is going to be, and I start off by asking what they understand about the organisation and about the role. That will start to answer that question for me is, do they want this job? Because for loads of roles, I'm looking for them to want my job, not just any job. Obviously, it would depend on what the role I was recruiting for, and I might be flexible with that with an unskilled role that I'm looking to recruit. But if they don't know what they're coming to, how can they make that informed choice as well? So I ask them that. I'll let them know I'll fill in the gaps if there are any, but I'll tend to wait to fill in those gaps till the end, because I don't want to give them all of the answers that I want to hear at the end. So if I sit at the beginning and say, right, thanks for coming, right, this is the organisation, it's exactly what we're looking for, this is the job. So I'm looking for somebody to join my team who's really going to be bubbly and enthusiastic. I'm looking for them who can work on their own initiative. They've got to work within a team. I don't want anybody who's just going to sit in the corner doing their own thing. Right, so do you like working in a team? Of course, they're going to say yes. They're going to tell me exactly what I want to hear. So I tend to tell them I'll fill in some gaps at the end. I'll then talk through their skills and experiences, ask them to tell them about themselves, what they've done in the past, and bringing me up to date, and perhaps delve in and ask some more probing questions when they give some results in there. And then at the end, I'll tell them, okay, so to fill in the gaps that you had at the beginning, this is what we're about, this is what we're looking for. So they can make that choice as well. Competency-based interviews, which I really do like and a big fan of, gives the actual examples. So they tell me about a time when. So tell me about a time when if you're looking for teamwork, tell me about the time when you've worked as part of a team. Now, sometimes the candidates do need some coaching in this. So I can't remember offhand, You've got to think in advance. You can accept an example from out of work. It may be appropriate to do that if it gives you a good example. If they're a student, it could be examples in the coursework. So tell me about a time when you've had to work to a deadline. Give them time to think about it. Don't be pushy. Say it's fine, just have a think. If they can't answer it, you might want to go back and say, when you worked here, that seems like it was quite pressurized. Were there any deadlines in it? And prompt them into answering that question. And then you can probe further. So tell me about a time when you've worked as a team. What was the task that you were doing? Was it successful? If you had to do it again, is anything you would do differently? And when people relax into that, I can guarantee that they'll start telling the story of real life of how it happened, and you will find out much more information in there. So we should get some good results of how these skills have been used. But your interviewers must be trained on how to use that technique, and that's something, if you're HR, there's a lot of HR people on the webinar today, if it is something that you want to delve further into with your managers, if they do the interviewing, to train and develop them on doing competency-based interviews. So I mentioned about being objective, and naturally we will like what we are like. That's human nature. But we're not recruiting a team of friends. And wouldn't it be boring if everybody was exactly the same? And I said, I've recruited people I thought, I can't stand that person, but they were absolutely fantastic, and I'm going to recruit them in there. So we've got to try and be objective. Naturally, we want people to fit into the organisation and our team culture and bring something to that, but that doesn't mean the same. Remember diversity in there. Try not to make assumptions on there. We're looking at recording observations and taking note of that. So if somebody has had, if you've got I'll use this because it's a classic stereotypical example, a woman on there who's had a period or a career break for a year, and on the gap on the CV, and don't assume this may be maternity. It could be something completely different. It could be that she went off travelling and did something different, looked after a relative. So don't make assumptions on there. Really probe in to get the information that you need and have that accurate recording. Record your facts and observations, not your feelings and interpretations. Be absolutely clear in your mind of what you're looking for and what skills you want for that role, and then make sure you record the information around that. Okay, so I'm going to move on to finally some of my top tips. Margaret, first I'll just answer your question. Do you think that group interviews are useful? I do, for the right role. I have done these quite recently for graduate recruitment, because they can be very cost efficient to do that, and especially when you're looking, if you haven't got a great deal of past to look back onto that will give you a lot of information in your selection. A group interview can be good because you're getting a better flavour of those softer skills and the interactions. I also used a group interview for, sorry Margaret, just asking, so you mean a group of candidates or a group of interviewers? Just going back to that, I've used a group session assessment centre for an administrator, which when I did invite people to that, some of the candidates thought, this is a bit heavy for an administrator, but the feedback was brilliant. So we could bring people in, watch them interact together, because this organisation, as I say, it was the one I mentioned that used profiles as well. They're very family oriented, they value the team, and those are successful people in the organisation that stay with the business because they enjoy that and they perform better. So we decided to do assessment centres where we could have a group task. We'd then take them off individually to do interviews, and we'd do some profiling on the day. It only ran for half a day. We could then give information about the company too, so they could see what they were joining. And we got massively positive interview from those candidates, and it fit, and the time constraints were really good to fill that role as well. Kathy has kind of asked you to reimburse travel expenses to the interview. What is your view on this? You need to be upfront at the beginning of where they are. There's no legal requirement to do so. And if you want to do that, I would just... I've done it before when I recruited somebody with very specific skills that lived in Aberdeen, and the role was in Yorkshire, and we offered travel expenses to that candidate because we really wanted to see this candidate because the skills were quite unique and valued. But generally, I haven't done an awful lot for this. I don't think it's a given that people need to have it these days. It's not that expected. If you think of another, using agencies for recruitment, agencies would very rarely offer travel expenses, and they interview a lot of candidates. So I think it would depend on the role, the level of the role, and where you're asking them to travel from, and for how long. If it was a selection centre where you're bringing people from around the country and you wanted them to stay over all night, depends how eager you are to get these people with the skills to you of what you want to offer, but it definitely isn't the norm, so it depends on what budget you had and what you wanted to do. I think if I was asked after the event, and I hadn't budgeted for it or hadn't planned for it, I didn't think it was reasonable, my answer would probably be no. Sorry, I moved on from my top tips there because I'm talking too much. Okay, so top tips for a successful selection. Plan. Do your work beforehand. Be prepared. Know what you're looking for and what you want to ask. If you don't know, I think far too often we're not fully sure of what we're looking for, and we're waiting for this shining star of candidate to sit in front of us, and we'll think we'll just know. Unfortunately, life isn't like that, and we won't just know. The other thing is, I'm a massive fan that we recruit people for our organisation, and we don't we don't make roles for people. And that's something that I bang on to my clients about all the time. At a networking event, I actually met somebody that was telling me they just recruited this brilliant person at the organisation, and she'd done I think she'd done something like marketing. She came so highly recommended. She'd worked for all these big companies, and references were glowing. She was amazing. So great. What job's she going to do for you? Telesales. Right. Well, she's great at marketing, but you bring her into telesales. So how do we know she's going to be great at telesales? And the unfortunate thing in that it's just got bad news wrote all over it. And in my experience, you'll end up either having to discipline and dismiss the person because they're not doing what you want them to do, or they'll be very, very disillusioned with the role and you'll lose them anyway and you've wasted in it. So make sure you're planning for what you want. Have skilled assessors, invest in it. Recruitment costs us so much money, so we want to try and get it right at the beginning, and we need to work very hard on that. Match a selection tool to the role that you're looking for and the competencies. As I say, if it's somebody who's going to be on the telephone, you might choose to do a telephone interview. But if they're going to know nowhere near a computer, then obviously we don't want to do some online tests with them or test their typing, for example. So just make sure that we match there. Match a selection tool to your resources. We might think it's lovely to do all sorts of different things, but if you don't have the people available in an organisation, we don't have the room available in an organisation, and we don't have the money there to do it, there's no point in dreaming of what we may do. So just make sure those are matched right. But it doesn't have to be a massively costly exercise. So a lot of the selection tools that I use are really cost effective. And now, because there's lots of other ways to recruit, we don't need to be perhaps spending £1,000 that we did previously spend on agencies, for example, to recruit somebody. Okay, sorry that Vicky has to leave. She sent me a private message there. I do realise that I'm going on, so I'm going to rush through these quite quickly. If anybody does have to leave, it will be available, but I'll get through these as soon as I can. Remember, talk less, listen more, 80-20. Don't give much too information. You want to find out a lot about them. Don't give them the opportunity to respond and answer and take notes from there, but make sure you are presenting the organisation how you are and they have enough information to make a valid choice themselves, and take good, accurate notes. As I said before, recruit for roles, not for people. So don't bring in this great person if you haven't got a role for them. It won't end well. And think about what memory aids you want to use. I can have terrible memory. And if you are doing a large recruitment drive, you might want to think of the memory aids that you want to do, but make sure you're not leaving yourself open for any discrimination there. So the notes that you take, remember what those memory aids are in the notes that you've taken, and that's why the photos can come in useful. But just remember in there that you're not leaving yourself up for anything. I always say pause before your decision. I wouldn't be looking to make an offer at the end of the interview. You might think you've found the best person ever, but it's good to just pause and collect your thoughts and feelings and make sure you're making that right decision. If you're recruiting a good salesperson, they'll always try to close you at the end, that I would give a big tick for that for them because they've got good skills. But really, I would really strongly recommend you pause before you make that decision. But don't leave your decision too long. Good people get snapped up and you lose them from the market, and you don't want to keep them hanging around. And think about the feedback that you want to give to the other people. It's good practice, decisions, feedback is very rare, and yet Rich, just reading yours, not following applications and giving feedback after the interview is very rare. There are some tools available. I use an online system that is actually part of the group here in Shorebird, where applications can be managed, and Shorebird itself does have some very good recruitment solutions, that things are very automated, that they can get responses back when they've had an application, say thanks for your information, because it can be very hard as a candidate where it disappears off, especially now lots done online, and you're not sure whether it's been received. It just disappears into the whole of the big web. So there's some great application systems that Shorebird can speak to you about that can do that automatically for you and allow you to give feedback to people. I always give an option of feedback depending on and how you're doing it, especially after assessment centres, that there is a facility for people to call for feedback, and that's generally welcomed. But ultimately, relax and enjoy. Interviewing should be a very pleasurable experience, because you want to put the person at ease to find out more from them, and you want to be at ease so that you can gain more from the experience. And, it's very interesting to find out of other people, and it can be a very rewarding part of HR to find people and match them to the organisation and see them flourish in their careers and bring a lot of skills to the business. So ultimately, have a good time. Okay, so we've had quite a lot chat as we've gone through, which means we have spilled over in time, which I do apologise for. If anybody has any further questions or feedback that they want to add there, I'm actually going to stop the recording. So any questions that you want to ask now that won't be on the recording, I can do that when I just press this button. Okay, just bear with me. Bear with me. Sorry. Managing that.